Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with part 9 of The Origin of Freemasonry and Knights Templar by John R. Bennett. Israelites. Israel, Hebrew, Yah Israel, a prince with God, the name bestowed upon Jacob when he wrestled with an angel at Peniel, Genesis 32:28. Afterward, the distinctive name of his descendants. Meneptah. Egypt, a celebrated country in the north of Africa at the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The Hebrews called it Mizraim, and hence it is now called by the Arabs Mizrah. The Greeks and the Romans called it xxxii, whence Egypt, but the origin of this name is unknown. Ramses the Great of Egypt was succeeded by King Meneptah, who is now generally accepted by historians as the Pharaoh of the Exodus of Israel. The history of this remarkable race begins with the call of Abraham from his home at Ur, the city of his birth, usually called Ur of the Chaldeans, near the Euphrates, in the northwestern part of Mesopotamia, to his promised abode in Canaan. Abraham was a son of Terah, a descendant of Shem, and born in 1996 BC. In 1922 BC, he went to Haran, in Mesopotamia, a region northeast of the Euphrates, accompanied by his father, his wife Sarai, his brother Nehor, and his nephew Lot. Genesis 11:26-32. His father dies soon after, and he takes his wife and nephew and enters the land of promise, or Canaan, as a nomad or wandering shepherd. Sojourning for a time at Shechem, he built here, as was his custom, an altar to the Lord, removing from place to place for convenience of water and pasture. He was at length driven by famine into Egypt, returning to Canaan in 1918 BC. Rich in flocks and herds, he left Lot to dwell in the fertile valley of the lower Jordan on the plain of Sodom, and pitched his own tents in Mamre, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Genesis chapter 12 and 13. Here his descendants multiplied to the 5th generation. He became greatly renowned for piety and wisdom and was called a friend of God. Sarai, his wife, being barren, gives Hagar, his Egyptian handmaid, to Abram, and in 1910 BC Ishmael was born. Genesis 16:11 and 12. God's covenants with Abram changes his name to Abraham, institutes circumcision, and promises Isaac by Sarah, whom he calls Sarah. In fulfillment of the divine promise, Isaac was born in 1896 BC in the extreme old age of his parents, Abraham being 100 and Sarah 90 years of age. In 1859 BC, Sarah dies, and 5 years later, Abraham marries Keturah, by whom he had 6 sons. Abraham dies in 1821 BC, aged 175 years. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, bury him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephraim, which is before Mamre or Hebron. Genesis 25:9 and 10. Isaac at the age of 40 marries Rebekah, his kinswoman, who bore him twin sons, Esau or Edom, and Jacob, afterwards called Israel. They were born in 1836 BC, but the place of their birth cannot be ascertained from the narrative in Genesis 25, except that it was in Negab or south country of the land of Canaan. Esau was the firstborn and the favorite of his father, but Jacob, in his early manhood, by the aid of his mother, obtained the birthright. Genesis 27. And in fear of the rage of Esau was sent away by his parents to his uncle Laban at Haran in Mesopotamia, where he married his cousins Leah and Rachel, and resided 20 years, becoming wealthy in flocks and herds. Jacob then returns to Canaan with his family and his riches. Arriving near home, he meets his brother Esau, and in a rather dramatic personal interview, they become reconciled. Genesis 33. Isaac dies at Hebron in 1716 BC, aged 180 years. and is buried in the cave of Machpelah with his father. He was a man of gentle nature, a nomadic herdsman of devout and blameless life. Joseph was the 11th of the 12 sons of Jacob, and was born in Haran in Mesopotamia about 1745 BC. He was the favorite son of his father, and envied by his brethren on that account. Their enmity was further excited by two dreams in which his future greatness was foreshadowed, and this led them to sell him as a slave to some Midianite traders, by whom he was carried into Egypt, and sold to Potiphar, an officer of the king. The Midianite traders were an ancient Arabian race, the descendants of Midian, the fourth of the 6 sons of Abraham. By Keturah, they appear to have dwelt mainly to the south of Moab, and covering a territory extending to the neighborhood of Mount Sinai. Joseph acquired the confidence of his master, who set him as overseer over all his property, but having repelled dishonorable propositions made to him by his mistress, she accused him falsely to her husband, and caused him to be thrown into prison. Here he interpreted the dreams of 2 of his fellow prisoners, the chief baker and the chief butler of the Pharaoh, and when his predictions had been justified by the results, he was summoned by the king Pharaoh, at the instance of the butler, to interpret 2 dreams which portended 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine. The king was so much struck by the wisdom of the advice given by the young Hebrew that he adopted all the suggestions for making preparations for the time of famine, and appointed him ruler over the whole land. The measures taken by Joseph as vizier or viceroy resulted greatly to the advantage of the king and his people, securing an abundant provision for the time of the famine. This calamity extended also to the adjoining countries, and led Jacob to dispatch his sons to the Egyptian granaries to purchase corn, and there the brothers were brought face to face with Joseph, who recognized his unnatural brethren, and after a series of stratagems, Genesis 14, by which he reminded them of and punished them for their crime, the whole family, by his request, to the number of about 70, was brought into and established in the land of Goshen, or Ramses, as it was called by the Egyptians. This was about 1706 BC. Note, this date has been sharply contested. Some authors claim it should be about the year 1550 BC. Here they grew and multiplied for nearly 215 years. Joseph married a daughter of the high priest of On, or Heliopolis, and had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who became the progenitors of the tribes bearing those names, the most powerful of the future kingdom of Israel. Joseph preserved his authority until his death, which occurred in 1635 BC at the age of 110. His body was embalmed, and at the time of the Exodus was carried to Palestine and buried at Shechem, where his tomb is still shown. Jacob died in Egypt in 1689 BC, aged 147 years. His body was embalmed and buried with great pomp and all the possible honors in the burial place of Abraham, near Hebron. Genesis chapter 1. For a growing time, the Israelitic tribe was held in honor by the government and people, but later, the ruling class began to look askance at the strangers and then to oppress them. They were sat to work at building and digging. They were sat to sweat in the brickyard and were beaten by taskmasters until they broke out in insurrection. In the course of time, denial of religious privileges complicated and intensified the rebellion. In the year 1573 BC, Pharaoh orders all the male children of the Hebrews to be drowned. 2 years later, Jochebed and the wife of Abram, a Levite, succeeded in concealing her infant 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she put him in a basket of papyrus and placed the basket among the rushes of the Nile, and set his sister Miriam to watch from afar. Finally the king's daughter found the child, and being struck with its beauty, determined to adopt it, and set Miriam to fetch a Hebrew nurse, who conceived the idea of getting her mother, and thus Jochebed became nurse to her own child. According to Exodus 11:10, the child was adopted by the king's daughter, who called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And according to Acts 7:22, he was initiated in all the secret wisdom of the Egyptian priesthood. But the Bible tells us nothing of his youth from his adoption by the princess to the day when he slew an Egyptian overseer for his barbarous treatment of a Jewish slave. This was in the year 1531 BC. He was then compelled to flee from Egypt and live many years in the land of the Midianites with Jethro the priest, whose daughter he married and whose flocks he tended. In 1491 BC, he was called, according to Exodus 3 and Acts 7:30-34, from the wilderness of Mount Sinai, where he was tending the flocks of his father-in-law, to free his brethren from slavery in which they did. He returned to Egypt, but at first he was received by his countrymen with suspicion, and by the Egyptians with contentment. Nevertheless, Moses appeared as a leader of his people and demanded, in a personal interview with the king at Tanis, the privilege of conducting them a 3-day march into the desert to sacrifice to Jehovah. But Pharaoh replied by charging the Hebrews with a purpose to escape their task under a pretense of piety, whereupon Moses, by signs and wonders done in the king's house and kingdom, humbled the monarch and compelled him to let the people go. Exodus 13. Exodus of Israel. After some delays, the Israelites departed along the banks of the canal, touching the principal Hebrew towns and gathering their population as they went. The route then lay through the Wadi Tumulat Valley, which extended to the Gulf of Suez, where they arrived a few miles south of the present city of that name. Here the fugitives were hemmed in by the forces of the Pharaoh, which had been sent after the retreating host. At this point in the Gulf, there is a shallow stretching from shore to shore, almost fordable at low tide. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Over this the host of the Hebrews, numbering, it is said, 603,000 men of soldier age, or more than 2 million in all, crossed to the other side in safety, which the Egyptians in pursuit essaying to do were drowned. For the waters returned to their place, while the Pharaoh's horses and chariots, with wheels clogged in the mire, were panic-stricken and overwhelmed. The Israelites had no sooner escaped from the Egyptians than they were attacked at Rephidim by the Amalekites, whom they are said to have defeated. Exodus 17. The Amalekites were a nomadic and warlike people, of whose ancestors there is no record. But at the time of the Exodus, they occupied the wilderness between Egypt and Palestine. They lived generally in migrating parties, in caves or in tents, like the Bedouin Arabs of the present day. After the defeat of the Amalekites, Moses led the people to Mount Sinai in Arabia, which is situated in that country known as the Sinaitic Peninsula, that lies between the horns of the Red Sea, or the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba, and is the place where the law of Jehovah was given and the Jewish economy instituted. The Jewish Tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant were here constructed in the year 1490 BC by Aholiab and Bezalel under the immediate directions of Moses. The tribes were numbered after their families by the house of their fathers, who were the descendants of Abraham, or the 12 sons of Jacob. The 12 sons were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. The Levites were set aside to have exclusive jurisdiction over the national worship, and as they were not to inherit lands, the 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, were chosen as their father's representatives and became progenitors in the 12 tribes of Israel. The tribe of Levi received, instead of a province, 48 cities scattered throughout Canaan, and the 10th part of the fruits of the field, and were allowed generally to settle throughout the land where they chose. Aaron, who was Moses' brother of the tribe of Levites, by miraculous judgment, became the first high priest. High priest of Israel. Moses directed that 12 rods should be laid up in the Holy of Holies of the Tabernacle, one for each tribe, the name of Aaron on one rod to represent the tribe of Levi. And Moses said, "The man's rod whom I shall choose shall blossom." On the next day, these rods were brought out and exhibited to the people, and while all the rest remained dry and withered, that of Aaron alone budded and blossomed, and yielded fruit. Numbers 17. Philo-Judaeus says that Moses was instructed by the Egyptian priest in the philosophy of symbols and hieroglyphs, as well as in the mysteries of the sacred animals. The sacred historian tells us he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And Manetho and other traditional writers tell us that he was educated at Heliopolis as a priest under his Egyptian name Osirsiph, and that there he was taught the whole range of literature and science which it was customary to impart to the priesthood of Egypt. It is not strange, when he began in the wilderness to establish his new religion, that he should have given a holy use to the symbols whose meaning he had learned in the ecclesiastical education on the banks of the Nile. The Tabernacle. The tabernacle itself, according to Josephus, 45 feet long by 15 feet wide, being east to west. The sides were 15 feet high, and there was a sloping roof. There was no place of entrance except at the eastern side, which was covered by curtains. It was divided into 2 apartments by a richly decorated curtain. There were suspended, so as to cover the sides and top of the tabernacle, 4 curtains. The first or inner curtain was composed of fine linen, magnificently embroidered, with figures of cherubim in shades of blue, purple, and scarlet. This formed the beautiful ceiling. The outer covering or curtains were of goat hair and the skins of rams and other animals colored red. The 2 sides and the western end was formed of boards of shittim wood overlaid with thin plates of gold and fixed in solid sockets or bases of silver. It was surrounded by a court, the walls of which were made of fine twined linen, attached to pillars bound with bands of silver and sat in sockets of brass. The length of the court was 150 feet, the breadth 75 feet, and its height 7.5 feet. The tabernacle in all its structure was arranged for convenient packing, transportation, and setting up. But nevertheless, in size, in beauty of workmanship, and in the costliness of material, was a magnificent structure for the wilderness. The tabernacle was carried by the Israelites in their wanderings. During their march through the wilderness, the 12 tribes had between them 4 principal banners or standards, to which reference is made in the book of Numbers chapter 2. Every man of the children of Israel shall pitch by his own standard. But as to what were the devices on the banners or what were their various colors, the Bible is absolutely silent. To the inventive genius of the Talmudist, We are indebted for all that we know or profess to know on this subject. Wherever the Israelites halted, they encamped, with 3 tribes on each side of the tabernacle. The tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun on the east side under the standard of Judea. Reuben, Simeon, and Gad on the south side under the standard of Reuben. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin on the west side under the standard of Ephraim. Dan, Asher, and Naphtali on the north side under the standard of Dan. The Levites in the midst of the camp. The Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was a chest in which were kept the 2 tablets of stone, on which were engraved the 10 Commandments. It contained likewise a pot of manna, Aaron's rod, and the tablets of the covenant. It was always deposited in the most sacred place of the tabernacle. It was made of shittim wood, overlaid within and without with pure gold. It was about 3 feet 9 inches long, 2 feet 3 inches wide, and of the same extent in depth. It had on the side 2 rings of gold, through which were placed staves of shittim wood overlaid with gold, by which, when necessary, it was bore by the Levites. Its cover or lid was of pure gold, over which were placed 2 figures, called cherubim, with expanded wings. Exodus 25. The cover of the ark was called Kaphiret, from Kaphar, to forgive sin, and hence the English name of mercy seat, as being the place where the intersection for sin was made. Aaron's rod was made sacred and carried in the ark from the manner in which the tribe of Levites were chosen to be invested with the priesthood. The pot of manna was placed in the Ark of the Covenant to commemorate the heavenly bread, by which the Israelites were sustained in the wilderness, and is considered as a symbol of life, not the transitory, but the enduring one of the future. Having again taken up their march and arriving at the wilderness of Paran, Moses sent 12 chosen men, 1 of each tribe, to examine the land of Canaan, who, after 40 days, returned to Kadesh Barnea, a city at the southeast border of Palestine, and bring an evil report of the land. Caleb and Joshua, who were among those that searched the land, said to the children of Israel, "Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which floweth with milk and honey." But the people murmur and rebel, and God swears in his wrath that none of the murmurers shall enter the land, but be consumed in the desert, where they are doomed to wander 40 years. The people, however, resolved to enter Canaan against the will of God, but are this time repulsed by the Amalekites. Numbers 13 and 14. Moses then, in his progress from Sinai to Canaan, a desert march from station to station, through a period of 40 years, arrives with his people near the border of Palestine in the desert of Zin, and from there seeks passage through the land of the Edomites, descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, but is positively refused and threatened with the sword should he make the attempt, whereupon the Israelites turned away, avoiding the Moabites and the Ammonites, descendants of Lot by his 2 daughters, but proceeded bloody against the kings of the Amorites, Sihon, who reigned in Heshbon, and Og at Bashan. Both of these chieftains lived east of the Jordan, and were the descendants of Canaan, an ancient patriarch, a son of Ham, and the ancestor of the Canaanites. They were dispossessed of their lands, which were bestowed on the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and a half-tribe of Manasseh. Numbers 32. Aaron died on Mount Hor in Edom, Arabia, in the 40th year after leaving Egypt, at the age of about 123 years, and was succeeded in the priesthood by his son Eleazar. Not long after this, in the year 1451 BC, Moses died on Mount Nebo. one of the Abram range of mountains, which is in the land of Moab. This is over Jericho, at the age of 120, and was succeeded in authority by Joshua of the tribe of Ephraim. Joshua proved himself to be an able and resolute general. He led tribes of Israel across the Jordan into Canaan, or the Holy Land, and then began a war of extermination upon the native inhabitants. All were exterminated except the Gibeonites, who secured their safety by stratagem. Joshua 9, and became a dependent or servile class among the Hebrews. The tabernacle was set up at Shiloh in 1444 BC, and the rest of the land of Palestine divided, making in all 12 confederate states according to the tribes. Joshua 28. Joshua died in the year 1443 BC at the age of 110 years. Then followed a series of judges as rulers for nearly 350 years. In the year 1611 BC, just before the battle of the Israelites and the Philistines at Ebenezer near Shiloh, the Ark of the Covenant was brought from Shiloh into the camp of the Israelites to inspire them with greater courage and confidence. But the Philistines overcame them, captured the Ark, and carried it first to Ashdod, then Gath, and from there to Ekron. In 1115 BC, it was returned by the Philistines from Ekron to the Israelites at Kiriath Jearim, a city of the Gibeonites situated about 9 miles northwest of Jerusalem, and there placed in the house of Abinadab, a Levite, where it remained 70 years before being converted to Jerusalem. 1 Samuel 4-6. The tabernacle was taken from Shiloh to Gibeon, but the exact time of its removal is not known. In 1 Chronicles 21:29, it states that the tabernacle of Moses was still at Gibeon in 1017 BC. Again, in 2 Chronicles 1, 3-13, that the tabernacle still remained at Gibeon, and that Solomon went there to sacrifice before it. This is the last mention made of it. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.